In the first quarter of 2026, Russia lost 89,000 soldiers. Moscow was able to recruit only 80,000 new troops. For the first time since the 2022 invasion, Putin's army is losing men faster than it can replenish its ranks. And while the first maps of the front lines are being drawn in Kyiv, showing Ukraine regaining more territory in February than it is losing, a Ukrainian drone strikes a Russian oil port on the Baltic coast once again. Reuters is now calling it the most severe disruption to Russia's oil supply in modern history. 40% of export capacity, around 2 million barrels per day, is offline. This is no coincidence. This is no setback. This is a system collapsing. And anyone reading this spring's figures understands why people in the corridors of the Kremlin are now whispering instead of shouting. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll show you how a single strategy, not artillery, not waves of tanks, but precise, inexpensive, unmanned technology, is hollowing out the world's second-largest military machine from within. And why even Russia's most expensive prestige projects, from the T-14 Armata to the Black Sea Fleet, have become powerless against it. Let's start with the reality on the front lines. In March 2026, the Ukrainian military leadership reported a new monthly record: 35,351 Russian soldiers killed or seriously wounded. Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov publicly stated that these figures are backed up by video footage of every single strike in the system. And the key point: 96% of these casualties were caused by drones. Not to artillery, not to assault rifles, not to airstrikes in the traditional sense. To drones. Quadcopters, FPV kamikaze drones, heavy bombers like the Ukrainian Baba Yaga, a technology that was still considered a hobbyist project 5 years ago, is now annihilating a ground army on an industrial scale. The figure that changes everything comes from the Ukrainian presidential office. Colonel Pavlo Palisa, deputy head, told the RBC Ukraine agency. In the first quarter of 2026, Russia lost 316 soldiers per square kilometer of captured territory. By comparison, in 2025, the figure was 120. The cost of 1 square kilometer of Ukrainian soil has thus nearly tripled in 12 months. And while the Kremlin is trying to obscure this figure, the Institute for the Study of War in Washington confirmed in early April that Russian authorities paid compensation to the families of approximately 25,000 killed soldiers in the first quarter of 2026. In the first quarter of 2025, the figure was 20,000. In the first quarter of 2024, just under 10,000. The curve isn't going down. It's going straight up. But the true strategic disaster for Moscow isn't the number of dead. It's what Izvestia and TASS will never publicly admit: recruitment is collapsing, and the quality of newly recruited soldiers is dropping dramatically. According to Horyanova, a Ukrainian military analyst, around 40% of newly recruited Russian forces now come from vulnerable population groups: prisoners, people heavily in debt, and those under social or economic pressure. They are not signing up out of patriotism. They are signing up because the alternative is imprisonment or financial ruin. The Ukrainian initiative, I Want to Live, which operates communication channels for Russian soldiers willing to surrender, documented that Russia was able to recruit an average of 940 men per day in the first quarter. The Kremlin's target for 2026 was 1,120 to 1,150. If this trend continues, Moscow will be short about 65,000 men by year's end. And that is precisely the point at which the system collapses. For a war in which more men die each month than are newly enlisted is no longer a war, it is a budget hole being plugged with corpses. And even the deepest strategic reserves cannot sustainably replenish that. President Zelensky confirmed on April 10th that Russian troops have begun deploying strategic reserves to the front lines to counter Ukrainian counterattacks in the directions of Oleksandrivka and Huliai-Pole. Strategic reserves are an army's last trump cards. You don't play them because you're winning. You play them because otherwise you'll lose. And at this point, we must ask ourselves, how did it come to this? How could an army of 140 million people end up in a demographic dead end against a country with a third of its population? The answer does not lie in Kyiv. It lies along a 1,200-kilometer-long line between Primorsk, Ust-Luga, Novorossiysk, and Kirishi. Let's talk about oil. Because without oil, there are no tanks, no air force, no pay for soldiers, no war. On March 25th, 2026, Reuters published a calculation that must have felt like a slap in the face in St. Petersburg. At least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity was at a standstill, around 2 million barrels per day. The causes Ukrainian drone attacks on all three of Russia's major western export ports, Primorsk and Ust-Luga on the Baltic Sea, and Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. Added to this is the Druzhba pipeline, which supplied Hungary and Slovakia, and has been virtually at a standstill since January, as well as about 300,000 barrels per day of Arctic oil from Murmansk, which cannot be exported due to tanker seizures in European waters. To grasp the scale of this oil and gas revenues, account for roughly a quarter of the Russian national budget. 40% of that being offline means that 10% of the entire national budget is in free fall. And this in an economy already groaning under Western sanctions inflation and a regional budget deficit of around $9 billion. If you've ever wondered how a country like Russia can go bankrupt without being formally insolvent, that's the answer. You cut its arteries. And the blade severing those arteries is a fleet of Ukrainian drones that costs less than a single Russian caliber cruise missile. On the night of March 26, 2026, more than 20 Ukrainian drones struck the Leningrad region. They damaged the ELOU-AVT-2 and ELOU-AVT-6 refinery units at the Kirishi plant, one of Russia's 5 largest refineries. The Ukrainian General Staff confirmed the strike. A day earlier, a wave of drones had set the Novatek terminal in the port of Ust-Luga ablaze, just 150 kilometers southwest of St. Petersburg. And here's the irony, some of these drones flew so low and so far that one detonated in Latvia and another struck the chimney of a power plant in Estonia after crossing out of Russian airspace. The Kremlin's defense is riddling itself with holes in every direction. Before we move on to the second part, where we'll examine why Russia's most expensive prestige weapons, the T-14 Armata and the Black Sea Fleet, are outright failing in this war, a quick note. If you appreciate analyses like this where we don't just regurgitate headlines, but break down the actual logic of modern warfare, then subscribe to Russia Crisis Report and turn on the notification bell. We publish in-depth analyses twice a week on drone wars, NATO technology, and the shifting geopolitical balance of power. No propaganda, no sensationalism, just numbers, sources, and context. Continue now. Let's talk about the T-14 Armata, about the tank that, according to Russian state media, was supposed to be the tank revolution of the 21st century. About the vehicle that Putin presented on Red Square in 2015, and which right there in the middle of the parade broke down and had to be towed away. This symbol was prophetic from the very beginning. Originally, 2,300 units were to be delivered between 2015 and 2020. In reality, at best, only a few dozen were produced. In the summer of 2023, Moscow sent a handful to the front lines in Ukraine for a firing test from long range without direct combat deployment. A few weeks later, they were withdrawn again. The official justification, as stated by Sergei Chemezov, head of the Rostec defense conglomerate, the Armata was too valuable to risk. The actual reason, as confirmed by Western intelligence agencies and the national interest, it simply did not perform. The reason is technical, and it is embarrassing. The T-14 was designed around an engine, the A-85-3, rather than developing an engine to fit a tank. The A-85-3 was more compact and powerful than the proven V-92S2F, but it was also complex, prone to malfunctions, and maintenance-intensive. Combined with sanctions that led to supply shortages of electronic components, the Armata became a monument to failed industrial planning. And that is precisely why you don't see any Armatas on the front lines in this war. You see T-72s from the 1970s drawn from strategic reserves. You see T-62s from Soviet-era warehouses. One could almost say the Kremlin is waging war with museum pieces because it doesn't trust its own modernity. But while Russia's most expensive land weapon remains in the factory, Ukraine is betting on the exact opposite. A startup culture born of necessity driven by urgency. Take the FP5 Flamingo, developed by Firepoint, a Ukrainian company founded by friends, a group comprising a civil engineer, a game designer, and an architect. The first prototype was unveiled in August 2025. 6-meter wingspan, a takeoff weight of 1,150 kilograms, a range of 3,000 kilometers, a speed of around 950 kilometers per hour, and a production rate that, according to chief designer Dennis Steilerman, stood at 3 missiles per day in mid-March 2026, with a stated goal of 210 units per month, and in the long term, 2,500 per year. On February 20th and 21st, 2026, Flamingo struck the Votkinsk machine building plant, a facility that manufactures Iskander ballistic missiles located 1,400 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Fabian Hoffman, a doctoral candidate and missile technology expert at the University of Oslo, summarized it this way. The weekend attack marked the first time Ukraine had directly struck a key target of the Russian missile industry with a heavy missile capability. On March 28, 2026, Flamingos destroyed the JSC Promsyntez explosives factory in Chapayevsk, Samara Oblast. A factory. An entire factory. And all of this from a company that didn't exist 5 years ago. What makes the Flamingo so valuable politically is not just its range, it's its independence. Ukrinform estimates that the weapon brings 90% of Russia's arms production capacity within range. And unlike ATACMS or Storm Shadow, it is not subject to any restrictions from Washington, London, or Paris. Ukraine no longer has to ask anyone's permission. This is a geopolitical paradigm shift whose significance is only just beginning to be understood in Europe. Kyiv is no longer dependent on what NATO capitals supply or approve. Kyiv produces its own weapons, and production takes place in bunkered facilities whose locations are kept secret, and which, according to Zelensky, were hit at least once by a Russian missile strike in early 2026, but were quickly brought back online. And then there is the Long Neptune, a further development of the R-360 Neptune, with which Ukraine sent the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, to the bottom of the sea in 2022. The Long Neptune now has a range of 1,000 kilometers and a 350-kilogram warhead. Unlike Western systems such as ATACMS or Storm Shadow, it is not an export item subject to restrictions. It is Ukrainian. It may be deployed anywhere the Ukrainian leadership chooses to deploy it. And that is precisely the difference between an army that waits for permission and an army that acts. Now to the Black Sea Fleet. The fate of this fleet is perhaps the sharpest metaphor for the entire war. In 2022, Russia had 74 ships in the Black Sea. Retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus recently said, "The fact that Ukraine, without possessing any significant warships, was able to sink or severely damage over a third of the Black Sea fleet and drive it out of Sevastopol and the Western Black Sea is an extraordinary testament to the Ukrainian tech sector and to the uniformed personnel at the control consoles. Two-thirds of the original fleet is still there, but they're hiding." On the night of March 1st to 2nd, 2026, a Ukrainian drone swarm struck at least 8 warships in the port of Novorossiysk. The governor of the Krasnodar region, Veniamin Kondratiev, stated on Telegram that the heaviest strike had hit Novorossiysk and declared a state of emergency. Satellite imagery analyzed by the open-source analysts at Cyber confirmed hits on the midship superstructure of the frigate Admiral Essen, one of Russia's last 2 major warships in the Black Sea. SBU sources stated that a fire on the ship's deck burned for about 18 hours. The radar and electronic warfare systems were destroyed. According to the SBU, the frigate is currently unable to deploy any more Kaliber cruise missiles against Ukraine, and the minesweeper Valentin Pikul lost its towing equipment, which technically reduces a minesweeper to a standard boat. But the crucial point is not the strike itself, it is the strategy behind it. Novorossiysk is the last refuge. Turkey closed the Bosporus to Russian warships in 2022. Sevastopol has become too dangerous, and there is no other port in the Black Sea with sufficient repair capacity. The analysis magazine Naval News summed it up. The protective harbor walls of Novorossiysk are turning into a cage. Every successful drone strike against a ship that can no longer move is a permanent loss. Russia has no way to escape, and every night that Ukraine activates its drone swarm is another potential night of losses. And here, the circle closes on the main focus of our analysis: logistical strangulation, combined with the asymmetric use of technology. If Russia can no longer deploy its Black Sea fleet to block Ukrainian ports, Ukraine exports grain. If Ukraine exports grain, it has foreign currency. If it has foreign currency, it buys Western technology and finances its own arms production. If Russia simultaneously loses 40% of its oil exports, its national budget shrinks. If the state budget shrinks, it can no longer increase recruitment bonuses. If recruitment collapses, the dead are no longer replaced. And if the dead are no longer replaced, Russia must burn through strategic reserves, the last reserves of a collapsing army. This is not a linear process. It is a vicious cycle, and Moscow is sitting right in the middle of it. The Ukrainian tactic that makes all this possible is known in English language analyses as bait and bleed. The idea lure Russian assault units to fixed points where precision artillery and drone swarms have already been calibrated. The Russians come. The Russians die. Ukraine cedes minimal territory, sometimes none at all, and inflicts maximum losses while suffering minimal casualties of its own. In February 2026, Russia barely managed to capture 50 square miles of territory, and in doing so for the first time in this war, lost less land than Ukraine was able to recapture. A piece of news that must not appear in the Russian state media, because it shatters the entire narrative facade of the inevitable victory. And this is exactly where things get really dangerous for the Kremlin. Because the war that Putin started in 2022 was sold to his people as a special operation, as something finite, controllable, as a matter of weeks. Today it is in its 5th year of war, with over 1 million casualties. A third of the Black Sea fleet sunk or severely damaged, 40% of oil export capacity offline, a regional budget deficit of $9 billion, mercenaries from Africa, Central Asia, and North Korea being flown in to plug the gap, and a prestige tank sitting in a warehouse in Nizhny Tagil because no one trusts it. This is no longer a war. It is a strategic bankruptcy scenario in slow motion. Its international reputation is also crumbling. According to reports, several traditional customers of the Russian arms industry, India, Egypt, Algeria, have begun reviewing contracts or seeking alternatives. When a T-90 burns in Kherson, an S-400 is taken out in Jankoy, and a Kilo-class submarine is damaged by a drone while docked. No defense minister in the world will buy these systems with a clear conscience anymore. What once generated between $12 and $15 billion in annual exports of Russian weapons is now a market with dwindling credibility. And arms exports were one of the last pillars supporting the Russian treasury. Added to this is the domestic political dimension, which no one in Moscow is allowed to address openly. When regional budgets have to cut recruitment bonuses, as is already happening in several Russian federal subjects, then the war reaches a point where it is no longer decided at the front, but in the office of a governor in Krasnoyarsk or Volgograd. ISW has observed that at least 12 federal subjects have increased their signing bonuses by 50 to 80% between mid-February 2026 and now in an attempt to compensate for declining volunteer numbers with money. At the same time, covert mobilization measures are being extended to companies and universities. This is no longer a classic partial mobilization. It is a creeping pressure on Russian society that already led to mass exoduses once in the fall of 2022. It would be naive to claim that the war will end tomorrow. Russia is not bankrupt. High oil prices, partly fueled by the Iran conflict, are still bringing significant cash into the Kremlin, despite the 40% disruption. Pipeline exports to China via Skoworodino-Mohe, the Atasu-Alashanku route, and the Iespo blend export via Kozmino remain intact, totaling around 1.9 million barrels per day. Moscow still has buffers. And this is the crucial point, these buffers are shrinking while Ukrainian production is growing. In March 2026, according to OSINT estimates, Ukraine carried out more drone attacks than Russia for the first time in this war. 274 air defense systems were hit. Drones flew over 1,500 kilometers deep to reach refineries and military facilities. And here is the aspect that many Western commentators overlook. Ukraine has not only built a technological edge in this war, it has completed an industrial learning curve that no NATO army in the world has ever gone through. Ukrainian soldiers now operate drone systems in 4-shift operations. They fly FPV missions with an intensity that neither Fort Benning nor Sandhurst can simulate. They iterate hardware in 48-hour cycles. A single brigade on the front lines in Donetsk tests more drone prototypes per week than some NATO forces introduce in a year. When sometime in the 2030s, the Bundeswehr, the British Army, or the US Army start thinking about next-generation drone warfare, they will have to invite Ukrainian veterans to teach them the basics. When you add it all up, the recruitment gap, the oil disaster, the fleet withdrawal, the Armata fiasco, the Ukrainian Flamingo and Long Neptune strikes the bait and bleed tactics, and the territorial collapse in February 2026, a picture emerges that will not be found in any Kremlin situation report. But it is real. Russia is no longer winning this war. Russia is merely enduring it. And the question that will arise in the coming quarter is no longer whether Putin can hold out, but how long it will take for the internal pressure of economic strangulation to cause cracks in Moscow's political system. What is remarkable here is Ukraine is not winning this strategic war of attrition with Western Abrams tanks or F-16 fighter jets. It is winning it with its own drones produced in converted factory halls in the south of the country. With software written by developers who were still programming video games in 2022, with a missile company founded by three friends from the fields of civil engineering architecture and game design. This is the future of war. And it doesn't look like an armata on Red Square. It looks like an inconspicuous drone nest on a country road in the Kharkiv Oblast, from which missions are launched every night against targets 1,000 kilometers deep into Russian territory. We've seen this moment coming for a long time. What happens in the spring of 2026 isn't the turning point. The turning point was already in 2024 in the Black Sea. What we're observing now is the consequence. The numbers make it official, and the numbers don't lie. If this analysis has helped you understand the situation beyond the headlines, then check out our video next. Russia Crisis Report. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay informed.